Welcome to Duke Fuqua Insights, a podcast where we explore faculty research and the actionable takeaways for business leaders at every level. Whether we're scrolling, shopping, or streaming, our data is constantly being collected, analyzed, and traded. We're often told that this data is incredibly valuable, and that sharing it leads to better products, more personalization, and smarter decisions. But what are the trade-offs of today's data economy? My name is Tanner Morgan, a recent graduate of Fuqua's daytime MBA program. I'm joined by Professor Ali Makhdoumi, an associate professor of decision sciences at Fuqua, to help answer these essential questions. His research explores how information flows through markets, shaping everything from pricing to privacy. He co-authored Too Much Data, a paper examining the unintended consequences of how personal data is bought and sold. Ali, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Tanner, for having me. Pleasure to be here.
So, to start off, I have a couple of questions for you. There's no shortage of analysis on how valuable data can be, but you focus instead on when there's too much of it. What motivated your research?
So I guess the conventional wisdom is that data is valuable for personalized advertisement, development of AIs, and perhaps, personalized AI tools, or personalized recommendation and so on. And more data is obviously better for these purposes. But what we argue in this work is, where does data come from? And in most cases, the answer to this question is, it's coming from people. And then the question is, are we having the right amount of data for what the tech companies or, platforms are compensating users for? And that's where, we argue data is underpriced and, we're having too much of it. In other words, there are two ways to look at it. So one is, for what the platforms are offering or, paying, we have too much personalized data collected from users. And, the other way to look at it is, I guess, and this is closer to policy design, is for the amount of user data that they're collecting, they should be paying more or compensating users more.
So it sounds like a key point in your research is that the effect of sharing personal data extends far beyond the individual. Why is that, and what are some of the economic consequences of that?
Great question again. The sort of broad intuition is quite simple. I guess in short, it is because of data externality. So let me explain this. So imagine that, I want to be very private. So I go to the basement of my house, not sharing any data. So does that mean that my personal data and, personal tastes will be protected? Not really. So why is that? Because the fact that my, friends, family, and colleagues who have, perhaps similar tastes to me are sharing their data reveals something about me as well. So this implies, personal data and privacy is more of a public good, and giving control to, individuals, even though necessary, is not going to resolve the whole issue. So we need more than that. So in fact, the issue remains, to exist, even if individuals are willing to share their data, even if I don't want to be too private, so I want to get the fair price for my data and share it. Then the issue still remains. Why is that? So imagine that you and I want to share our data and get a fair price for it, get a reasonable price for our personal data. So now the data buyer will come to you and say, I'm willing to purchase part of your data at a certain price, and if the price is good, you will share your data. Now the data buyer will come to me and say, well, now that Tanner's data has been, shared, given the correlation between your data, for instance, because, you're both affiliated with Fuqua, something about you has been revealed as well. So therefore, the sort of marginal value of my data has decreased. And I will be willing to share at a lower price than what I could get in isolation. So again, the data buyer will come to you and say, now that Ali's data has been revealed, the marginal value of your remaining data is lower, and I will be buying it at a lower price, and so on. So once you sort of create this market for personal data, you and I, as users, will end up competing with each other, and we will end up sharing our data at the very marginal price. So we will not get the fair price for our data. So I guess the bottom line is, when one person sells or gives away their data, others' privacy is compromised. Even if they don't want to share, or even if they're not sharing their data. And the economic consequence, I would say, is inefficient oversharing, meaning platforms acquire lots of data at very low marginal prices, and individuals are going to end up undervaluing their own privacy because of much of it has already been leaked by others.
You make a really interesting point on competition. Competition between platforms is often something that we believe can solve market problems. Can you explain the role of competition and its impact in this space?
Great question again. So, competition may or may not help in the context of market for personalized data as we study it. Why is that? Because once you have multiple platforms that are competing, we're going to end up having a fragmented market. Say users will join one of the two platforms. Now, there are fewer externalities on each of these platforms, and that can, increase prices. So users will be better off in that sense. However, there's some, benefits, for instance, for service quality and so on, that we only get if we have a lot of users on the platforms. And now that we have fewer users on a platform, those benefits are going to be less. So overall, this second force may dominate, and competition may worsen the user's welfare.
So one of the solutions you propose involves transforming the data to reduce its impact on others. How would this kind of quote-unquote decorrelation process work in a real-world setting?
Right. So I guess if you think about it, the issue is data externality or data correlation. So how can we fix it? We need to remove the correlation so that when I decide as a user to share my data, I only share my data and nothing about others. So technically, this involves removing statistical correlation between individuals' data. So my data will have a part that is orthogonal to others, and when I decide to share my data, I will be sharing only something about me myself and nothing about others. In practice, well, it's a hard question because it's hard to achieve. So why is that? Because to decorrelate the data of users, we need to have access to the data of all of them. And what that means is we're going to need a trusted party that collects the data of all individuals and somehow figure out how to decorrelate the data of each user from the data of others. But I guess we don't have a third party. We don't have a trusted third party. So it is hard to implement this in practice unless we come up with some smart ways of implementing this by some blockchain ideas and so on. But I guess the bottom line is once we decorrelate the data of users to make sure that when I decide to share my data, I'm sharing only something about me myself and nothing about others, then the issue will be resolved, and we're going to have efficiency in this market for personal data.
So many Fuqua grads go on to work in data-heavy industries, such as healthcare or tech. How should they or anyone else working in these fields be thinking about your research? And just as a quick follow-on, you also talk a lot about trust. What does it mean to have a more responsible data strategy?
Great question again. So I would say they should be thinking not just about what data they collect, but about whose privacy is being affected by that data collection. So in healthcare, for instance, in healthcare, you mentioned that, for instance, sharing one person's genetic data can reveal something about their relatives, for instance. So here in this context, a responsible strategy would sort of account for these externalities, perhaps by securing a group consent or adjusting compensation to reflect broader privacy costs. I guess like in any other context, a responsible strategy should take into account that privacy is a public good, and giving individuals control over their data, although it's necessary, is not really sufficient. For instance, take the sort of a more recent regulations that have been implemented in Europe, for instance, like the GDPR or the California one, CDPR. So at a high level, they're giving individuals control over their data. What we argue here in this paper is that we do have to do even more than that, because privacy or protecting privacy requires more of a public effort.
So before we wrap up, I'd love to hear a little bit more about where you think we go from here. Do you see a path where we rethink the role of personal data entirely? Or are we heading more towards an even deeper entanglement unless something dramatic happens?
Well, I guess that's one of the questions that keep me, awake at night. So we are clearly at a crossroads. If we continue down the current path, unregulated data markets, we'll see, worsening privacy violations and increasingly sort of distorted market incentives. And this is only going to benefit the platforms, and it's going to, keep reducing the user's welfare. But on the positive side, there is a sort of a growing awareness, both among, policymakers and also technologists, that, data isn't just an individual asset; it's a social one. Moving forward, we need to sort of rethink data governance, and there have been, some moves in Washington toward that, perhaps, by regulating data markets, implementing taxation or, mediation mechanisms, or by redesigning data architectures. And there are, many interesting ideas on, how one can implement those, regulations. And one thing I should highlight is that, there is no doubt that data is valuable and necessary for innovation. So the goal is not to halt innovation, but to sort of ensure that it aligns with, societal benefits and the user incentives. So I guess that's kind of important to keep in mind.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Professor. Really fascinating research.
Thanks again, Tanner.
Duke Fuqua Insights is produced by the Fuqua School of Business at Duke University. You can learn more at fuqua.duke.edu/podcast.